Hi, and welcome to the 20th Annual Brattleboro Literary Festival. My name is Carin Pratt. I am a longtime bookseller at the Norwich Bookstore and in Norwich, Vermont. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the writer Joanne Beard. She is the author of the essay collection, The Boys of My Youth, and the novel In Zanesville. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, including The New Yorker and Tin House, and she teaches writing at Sarah Lawrence. We're here today to talk about Festival Days, which is an essay collection published in March of this year. And I'll hold it up because I do think it has one of the best covers ever, which I believe these are bird cages, are they not, Joanne?
They are.
And it's it's the perfect book for somebody who likes to pick their horses by the colors. You could pick it, but I thought it was fabulous and just an incredible collection of essays that, in the end, the takeaway is that they make you think, and that's what you want essays to do, or that's what I want essays to do. Joanne, you say in your introduction, and this is a quote, "My first love was poetry, my second love was fiction, and my third and lasting love was the essay." How did that progression come about?
Sorry. That progression came about because I was, as an undergraduate student in my 30s, I was studying painting at the University of Iowa. And very late in my painting studies, I took a poetry writing class and really loved it. And then I took a fiction writing workshop and really loved that much more than painting, much more than any kind of an art class I had ever taken before. And so I started actually writing short stories and a novel. And then I ended up wanting to go to an MFA program, and I went to a nonfiction program essentially because I lived in Iowa, and they have a very exclusive writers workshop fiction program that I couldn't get into. So I got into the nonfiction program, which wasn't part of the workshop, and decided to study the essay, since those were the people who were willing to take me and teach me when I was interested in learning how to write.
So you've basically been studying the essay from the get-go,
Yeah, yeah, yes,
which is why they're so good.
yes.
I'm wondering if we can ask you to read a little bit from one of the essays, which is, I found quite moving. And it is about a dog. And I think you have it there, Joanne.
I do.
Yeah.
So I'll just read the first section of this essay called Last Night, which is about my dog, Sheba. Something happened to her while she was eating, or right afterward. She began turning in circles and couldn't stop. In my kitchen, in my car, and then in an examining room at the vet's office. I sat on the floor with her while the vet stood leaning against the wall, watching us. I was crying, but he ignored that. You indicated once, he said, looking through the file, that we should let you know when it might be time. It wasn't time. It looks like a brain abnormality, something that's grown or shifted. We might wait a day or so to see what happens, but if this doesn't stop, he paused. Sheba, stop, I said, and held her. She looked like Lady from Lady and the Tramp, only old. She was 15. It was like putting your hand on a spinning top, but as soon as I let go, she began turning again. We used to call her Top Dog because she liked to sleep stretched out on our old black lab. Her head settled on his head, both of their eyes closed. Once, many years ago, the lab had gotten carefully to his feet, made his way to the kitchen where my husband was cooking, and accepted a treat, all without disturbing the sleeping puppy draped over his neck. The lab lived to be 15 too, the marriage 14. I took my hands away to button my jacket, and she turned blindly for a moment on the gleaming linoleum, then bumped into the single leg of the examining table. It might be time, the vet said, putting his foot out to stop her. Except for those neon running shoes, he was completely nondescript, like an actor you aren't sure why is in the movie until the very end, when he turns out to be the killer. At home, it didn't get any better or any worse. Sheba following herself, nose to tail, around and around in a circle, while I tried to keep her steady. My neighbor came over for a few minutes and watched, her eyes round and nervous. "This doesn't look hopeful," the neighbor finally said. It was dark by then, and I was kneeling on my living room floor in the lamplight, holding her and then letting her turn, holding her and then letting her turn. It was winter, but the neighbor was wearing flip-flops. "Aren't your feet cold?" I asked her. "Yes," she said, and went home.
It's very difficult to write about animals, especially the death of animals, and not be sentimental. And it was, I found that essay was gripping and hard to read, but it sort of universalized an event that so many of us have had to go through, and did it um, a sort of a gentle way. And I was very moved by that. You do have a lot of death in these essays, and that's not to say that they're depressing, because they are not. But dogs, friends die, frogs die, ducks, John F. Kennedy, relationships die, cats die. I kind of lost count after a while. Why do you think that is?
You know, I don't really have an answer to that question, and other people have mildly suggested to me that I seem to be obsessed with death. But the thing that I will say is that for people who write personal essays, you generally take an experience you've had in your life and you use it to illuminate something bigger about the world. And so that means that we tend to go toward the experiences in our lives that are pivotal and that have had a profound effect on us. And so I guess, death falls into that category. Um, but also, this book is a collection of works over a long period of time, like 20 years. So I think they're almost self-selecting, that, those are the pieces that I pulled together to put in this book without really realizing that they each had this kind of possibly depressing element to them that was about death.
Right, but I did not find it depressing. I just found it notable, because in I often found myself laughing at a lot of places during these essays, because you're quite funny in a sort of setback kind of way. So I did not find them depressing in the least. There is a rhythm to your essays. I found that in many you pull back and forth from the present or actual time to a an incident in your past, or the character's past, and then rock back. How do you determine that sort of rhythm? I mean, or does it come organically?
I think it comes organically from my forcing myself in my writing process to write from a place that's deeply imagined. So it's almost like, the writing trance that you have to go into in order to be able to fully imagine and therefore describe what you're writing about. And it's funny because as a teacher of the essay and of short stories sometimes, I talk a lot about those decisions that writers make, or I should say I talk a lot about those things happening in people's writing, but I never really analyze or overthink my own work. I try actually never to look at my work in terms of analyzing the craft of it, um, just because I feel like there is a kind of magic that occurs when you're deeply imagining something and trying to write something that has literary merit, that you have to depend on the fact that some of it just can't be explained or described.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that because your essays, the reader has to pay attention to what's going on. I mean, I read a lot, and some stuff just you just read, but I had to turn off everything and shove the dog away. I had to pay attention while reading because you would refer back to previous statements or previous people or previous events, and I had to follow the thread, and
Mhm.
that's what made it quite engrossing. I was wondering, how do you write one essay at a time?
Yeah. Yep.
Always.
Yeah, always work on one thing at a time and and try to be fully immersed in it for the duration of that piece, whether it takes a week or a year, or in some cases a couple years. There are pieces in that book that I set aside for long periods of time. Um, but I never work on two things at once because I don't think my brain works that way.
Huh. The You had this a great image in one of the pieces. I can't remember which one it was, where you talked about climbing downward into my mental cellar, and I mean, I thought it was interesting for a couple of reasons. One, that it was a cellar and not an attic, but also that it was the perfect image for the retrieval of memories. And I'm wondering if you find that in your writing, you excavate memories that you didn't know you had.
Yeah. Yeah. I because so much of my work is memoir based, and so much of even the novel that I wrote was based in my own experience as a young person, as a, preteen and teen. So I've sort of over the years trained myself to remember and to hone my memory, which you can do. I talk to my students about it all the time. You have to be patient with it, and you have to understand what cues work for you to remember. For me, it's old photographs, and sometimes music helps me remember certain things.
Rack that back a little bit. You train yourself to remember.
Mhm.
Tell me again how you do that. I need to know.
Well, I'm not in any way, shape, or form woo-woo, but this is gonna sound woo-woo, is that I sit at my computer and I go into a kind of writing trance of memory, thinking and remembering until one detail will pull forth another detail, will pull forth another detail. And so much of my writing time is spent not putting words on a screen or on a page, but much of my writing time is spent pulling up these images and memories and trying to figure out how to apply words to that so that I can make it as vivid for the reader as it is for me, the writer.
Do you take notes? I mean, I'm trying to figure out how you would remember what you remember.
Um, my memory doesn't work as well anymore as it used to.
Nobody's
just,
does.
just in the typical way that happens when people get old. But I have to say that short-term memory is one thing, but long-term memory, I've got it. I can still recollect really detailed things from the past, and I can retrieve them and keep them. And especially because I used to be a painter, I think images and colors and the way the visual picture fits together comes sort of easily to me, or more easily to me than certain other things do. So yeah, but that said, one never is 100% sure that it's memory, because imagination also plays a very important role in writing. So sometimes I can trick myself into thinking that something is a memory, but it's really something that I'm imagining just from my knowledge of living in the world.
Well, that brings us to a question I had about imagination. And when I was reading these essays, and I'm thinking, was that true, or is that fiction, or is that nonfiction? I mean, there are two pieces of fiction in this, of stated fiction that you call fiction in this collection, but others are imagined experiences of others. And I started thinking, well, what does it matter? I mean, because it's, if it's fiction or nonfiction, who cares? Whether it is the imagination, but you have a remarkable ability to imagine what someone else is going through, and it's almost literary empathy, or I don't even know what to call it. But I wonder, there is a section we talked about earlier in Werner, where you, if you have the book there, if you wouldn't mind reading that section about imagining um, him. This is an essay. Wait, you can explain it. It's an essay about a man who lives the cliche of falling from a burning building. Uh, am I
Right.
describing it correctly?
Yes, right. So he wakes up and his building is on fire and he has to figure out what to do. Um, and he has a cat is in his apartment also, and his cat is named Two. Two didn't want to be held. She was going crazy. The black funnel had engulfed them completely now, and he tried not to breathe it. Hands clamped around Two's rib cage, Werner tried to take in glimpses of the window in the neighboring building straight across, perhaps 8 feet away. 4 panes of glass, 2/2. Stone sill on the outside, orange-red drapes pulled shut, a lamp behind them giving off an incandescent glow. The window would be like his, ancient and sturdy. The glass rippled, the wood thick with a century of paint. He wouldn't have the courage to climb out on his own ledge first, too much time to think. So he'd have to do it in one motion, hop up on the sill in the form of a racing dive. He had been a competitive swimmer from ages 7 to 12, a shivering, long-limbed boy in tight goggles and regulation trunks. He had a muscle memory of the stance, the bending, the tensing of the core. His toes would have to wrap around the sill to create the proper angle forward. He thought it all the way through and then knew enough to stop thinking about it. He was completely adrenalized now. He cinched Two under his left arm, pressing her as securely as he could to his torso, then placed his right hand, knuckles down, against the wooden sill of the open window. He spoke to his cat. Looks like it's time to go. In one motion, up and out. He waited an instant for his toes to wrap around the sill. They were there, but they hadn't all caught yet. When they did, he pushed off.
You must have interviewed this man quite a bit.
Yeah, I did. Um, I spoke to him for a long time. I got all of the details of what happened to him, and some details of who he was as a human being in the world and who he was as a boy growing up, etc. The kinds of things that would help me to create a kind of metaphorical meaning in the piece. Um, and then I let go of Werner's story as Werner, and I imagined it for myself as me having this happen to me. It's really hard to describe. And it's interesting because of your background as a journalist. Um, that basically what I'm telling you is that this is a true story that's also completely fictionalized. And
Right,
one
totally
thing
against standards.
I know, I know.
Not journalism. It's not journalism. It doesn't have to be.
No,
Did you
no.
go to see the building?
Yeah, yeah. I went with Warner and I stood on the ground and I looked up at the space that he jumped across from the window that he jumped into the window he jumped to. And and I collected voluminous notes, and then I spent a couple years actually writing the piece from my own point of view. I spent long enough writing it that I think Warner had forgotten the whole thing. But the important thing to note for me is that Warner was not particularly taken by this piece when he read it. And
So you let him read it before? Did you say I'm not going to publish it if you don't like
yeah,
it, or
yes,
you did?
I did. And I did that for the simple reason that Werner was really on the fence about. He wasn't on the fence. He really didn't want me to write the story, and I made a case for myself. And part of what I said was, if you don't like it and you don't feel like it is a fair treatment of what happened to you, if it doesn't feel right for any reason, I won't publish it. I really wanted to write it for the same reason that I want to write anything, which is that I want to have that writing experience, not that I want to put it out there in the world. And so Werner said, okay, with that as the caveat. And when
Why
he
didn't
read
why
it,
didn't he like it? It doesn't
I
show him
think
in a bad light at all.
no, but I think that what I can imagine, we didn't have a long conversation about it, and ultimately he changed his mind. He read it again 6 months later or something, and he felt better about it. But I think ultimately what happened is that it didn't feel like his experience. And he had the experience, he had the memories, it belonged to him. I wasn't taking his story, I was borrowing it, but nevertheless, I infused it with my own imagination, and it no longer felt like his story. And I think that that was startling to him, fair enough. And he had to live with it for a while. And then when he read it again, he said, yeah, okay. I don't think he really loved it, but we're friends. And I think he felt like, okay, now I can let her go ahead and do what she wants with it. But it still is not Werner's story. It's a story that is some amalgamation of Werner's story and my imagination. And it doesn't, I can understand why it wouldn't feel totally real and good to him.
Right. He probably didn't see it as a metaphor because it actually
Exactly.
happened. Right,
Exactly,
right,
because it couldn't have been more real than it was to
right,
him, and it was
right.
life altering. So,
Oh, wow. Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Well, it's you do the same sort of thing in the essay about the woman who dies, Sherry,
Mhm.
Sherry, Sherry.
Yeah, Sherry Tremble.
But of course, you couldn't ask her afterwards whether she cared about whether you published it or not. And
No,
and I go ahead.
but I was able to ask her, I interviewed members of her family and her friends, and I was able to ask them, and interestingly, they they were they were different in their reaction to me, but what I detected was that they didn't really recognize her in there. They recognized the scenario and they may have recognized themselves, but I never met their mother and their loved one. So their memory of her is so vivid and particular that I could never have captured it. So it truly does become its own thing. The essay does.
What do you mean when you said that their reactions were different? Different among them, or different than Werner's,
And
or?
their reaction was different than Werner's. Werner and
Mhm,
I had a deal, that I wouldn't publish it if he didn't like it. And he very honestly said, I don't like it. I don't think it's as good as your other writing. And those were all ways that he was trying to figure out why he didn't like it. But he didn't like it. I think Sherry's family had a little different reaction. They were never going to stop me from publishing it because, first of all, they missed her. And the idea of her story being out in the world in some way, I think made them happy. But I did detect that they didn't recognize her in that story very much.
which is actually fascinating because she comes across as this fully formed person struggling with what she was going through, which was horrendous. And she came across to me as a very brave and admirable person.
And I think she did to them too, but the very particular details of her personality are hard to convey to another person. So I sort of made them up on my own. And I think they just didn't really recognize her, gestalt or something in it.
Mhm,
But I'm sort of making that up. It was just an impression I had. They were
mhm.
completely lovely to me and still are.
Well, that is one of the more gripping essays in the collection too. I found that, coming to essays as I get a little bit older, I find that you get stuck in ways that you think about things, and that essays make you think in different directions. It's obviously you're having these experiences and not, or you're writing about these experiences and not me, but that's what I find the value of essays now. And it is it is a testament to these essays that they made me sort of sit up. And there's one great anecdote where you talk about well, for lack of a better term, an undergarment stuck to the side of a washing machine, and you say it was stuck to the side of the washing machine, of the washer, like a starfish.
Right.
And that just stuck in my head. And every time now I go to the washing machine and I pull out the wet washing machine, I think of that image, but I never would have thought of that image before had I not read that,
Right.
and it sort of opens up these windows.
Well, it goes back to that idea of fully imagining something and trying to make the writing as vivid as you can. And fiction writers have done this, and poets have done this for a long time. We don't always expect it in personal essays or in essays, um, because essays are more about ideas usually. I don't even know, I call these pieces essays, but I don't know if they really even, I don't know if in terms of genre, they really fall under that rubric, but I hope
Well,
they,
some reviewers have said that you're basically have are changing the definition of an essay, and in that now there is less of a definition, I guess, than there used to be. It's not like when you were writing a paper in school and you'd have to have the lead paragraph and you'd have to have the final thing, and so on and so forth. But with these, and they have different forms also, that you're changing the form to make it not formless, but and not that anything goes, because they're quite structured, but that there is no defining form to an essay.
um, yeah, well, I would prefer to not ever have to deal with the genre, to talk about ever whether things are nonfiction or fiction in terms of my own writing. It's not that I think that isn't an important question. It's a question I really care about when I'm reading. But when I'm writing, I try not to hold myself to any of those like structural questions where genre is concerned. I have no interest in misrepresenting my work ever, but I do think it's fair to say that there are forms of writing that don't fall directly within these structures. And I think that some of my work, but not just me, a lot of people, their work falls in this gray area between fiction and nonfiction, and even for some people, between nonfiction and poetry. So, yeah, I'm trying to think of an example.
How do you teach essays then to your students? I mean, do you teach a form? Do you teach that there is a form or not?
No, I don't. I don't.
And
We
do
look
you
at,
teach fiction
I
or
teach,
non?
no, I teach the personal essay, but if somebody comes into my class and their work teeters toward fiction, if that's what they're going toward, I give them free rein to do that. Again, I don't think you can misrepresent what you've done, but I would never hold a writer to any kind of rules about genre. I just wouldn't. I mean, what I'm trying to do as a teacher is pull forth creative work. And if what a writer in my class ends up writing is fiction, I would never criticize that. I would
In a
want,
way, it's quite freeing, isn't it? Or should be. You'd want it
I
to
think
be.
it should be. Yeah, I think it should be. I hope it is. For me, it is, but I never, because I started as a fiction writer and then I jumped over to nonfiction basically because I couldn't get into a fiction program. I took autobiographical short stories and I called them essays. And nobody in my program cared about that. I didn't misrepresent it. I represented it very honestly. They shrugged. They said, I think we can help you with your writing, And so I'm grateful for that. And I try to pass it along as a teacher with my own students.
Well, there is a quote though in the book where it sounds as if sometimes you don't really have all that much control over what you write. I mean, and I'll read it because I found it striking. You said, and once you begin an essay or a story or even a lecture, and there's an ellipsis, it takes on a life of its own. It's like getting on a sled at the top of a hill. You're steering, perhaps, but you're mostly a passenger.
Yes, but you have to allow yourself to be a passenger. Even if you're on a toboggan, you have to, in some ways, go limp in order to take that ride down the bumpy hill. And
I
I
thought you said
think
you weren't woo-woo.
you thought what?
I thought you said you weren't woo-woo.
I guess I am kind of woo-woo. Okay, I'm woo-woo. That's what I've come to in my life. I'm woo-woo. But I do believe that there are certain things, if you try to control them, they look controlled. And there were many years when I was so kind of tight ass with my writing and with my sentences that it was said to me by a friend who had my best interest in mind, your writing really does look like you're sweating over it. And at that point, I realized it was true. And I forced myself to relax because
Force yourself to relax.
there you go. See,
Yeah, there you
I'm
go.
a little bit type A, I have to say. I'm a little bit of a control freak. So control freaks have to teach themselves how to relax, get on that toboggan and just go limp and let the hill take you where it will.
How much revision do you do?
I do a ton of revision, mostly in my head before I put a sentence down. I write 20 versions of every sentence. And then once it goes down, it pretty much stays there.
so it almost gets back to what you were saying. You do all this in your head before you even start writing.
Yeah.
Are you sitting down? Are you walking? What are you doing? I mean,
Both of those things. I sit, I stare out the window, I take walks, I do things around my house. You know how when you're doing things around your house that turn off part of your brain and let your subconscious do the work? I do that. I drive to and from school. I have a long commute each week. And some of my best writing moments have happened in my head while I was
but
driving.
don't you have a hard time remembering it? Once
No,
and you're in a car, you
I have
can't
a
write
good
it down. You
memory.
can't write down notes. You can't.
Yeah, no, I have a good memory for stuff like that. The really important things in life, I have a good memory about those.
Well, I was reading an interview the other day with Amor Towles, who's got a new book out, and he writes one about every 10 years, and he said something to the effect that, and this is a big book. It's I have it right here. It's like 500 pages, and he said he had it all down in his head before he started writing, and I find that so hard to believe. But either he's lying or he's telling the truth. So who knows, but but you're saying exactly the same thing.
Some
Sort of.
version of that, some
Yeah.
version of that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think that those quiet moments when you're busy doing something else like driving or a sink full of dishes is where sometimes inspiration can come, when you're not directly trying to solve the problem in your head,
Hmm.
but you're indirectly trying to solve it. And that might be what that writer is talking about.
I wrote something else down, and I was reading this book, and I think it was from your book, but I'm not quite sure. So forgive me if it's not. But at one point, I think, because I tried to find it again and I couldn't, that you described yourself as a wallflower and an observer, which to me are the two perfect things to be an essayist. So you were in fact born to be an essayist.
That's right. I was the middle child in a growing up in a town in the Midwest, and I was left alone, really, in a very pleasant way to build my own imagination and my own world inside my head. And many years later, when I was in my 30s, it paid off because it turned out to be the best thing that a budding writer can ever be, which is an observer and somebody who doesn't need to be a participant, but enjoys being somebody who watches and pays attention.
Well, it's also much more interesting in my view, to be an observer and a wallflower. I
I think
mean,
so too.
and it's just the best.
Yeah.
What are your dreams like?
Vivid. They're
Do
very
you
vivid.
use them?
Do I what?
Use them? Do you write? Do you?
No, I'm not that woo-woo.
Just
Sometimes
a
I write
question.
them down. Sometimes I write them down and I share them with a friend of mine who spends a lot of time thinking about dreams. But I'm reading a book about dreams right now, and a nonfiction book about dreams. And mostly I think that it's just the brain firing off in the middle of the night.
Well, I basically hate listening to other people's dreams. So, as soon as I start reading about somebody's dreams in a book, I immediately like skip to the next part because I cannot stand it. I don't know why, but I can't.
I know,
Um,
I realize I'm very lucky that I actually have a good friend who, if I call her and go, I had the weirdest dream last night, she gets really excited. Like, tell me. Can
she
you
doesn't
imagine?
hang up on you. She tells you what it means,
She's
um,
into it, and then she tells me what it means.
which you may or may not want to know.
Right.
I'm wondering. And we talked about this a little bit earlier about this seems to be sort of the golden age of the essay, whatever that means, uh, and especially for women. And I was wondering if you had favorite essayists. There have been a lot of books. Rebecca Solnit, Megan Down, Gia Tolentino, Leslie Jamison, Rachel Kushner, Zadie Smith. I mean, it's just dozens of them actually. And I'm wondering what if you had a favorite. I mean, I'm not asking, you to rank them or anything, but
Well,
what
I
do you think is
do.
doing really interesting work?
Right. I really like the essays written by Gia Tolentino. And I like them not just because they're really good and because she's a young female writer and we need more of these, but because she's writing about things that are crucial right now. She writes about, well, she writes about everything, but I like especially the stuff she's written about the internet and social media and stuff like that. And my students really love her work. And um, and anybody who can, get young people reading the form of the essay is great for me. So I really like her, and I think that book, that collection of her essays called Trick Mirror, is just really brilliant. I love it.
Well, as you know, as I said, I work in a bookstore, and I have two sons, and my younger son came up to me before the Gia Tolentino book came out, and he says, "Mom, can you get me the galley of the?" I didn't, I read the New Yorker, but I hadn't really focused on her name, and I said, "Well, okay," So when it came, I gave it to him, and then of course I read it because I thought, here's a man, in his 30s, and he's reading this woman and thinks she's fabulous, and then I thought she was great too. I mean, it's um, to have somebody that young, and also talking about social, like you said, the internet and social media, which you're my age. We didn't really grow up with it. We don't, I don't know
Right.
about you, but I'm not all that engaged in with it. I don't have time. I've got too much stuff to read. So it's great to have somebody explain what's going on, sort of, and what's influencing my kids, clearly. So
Yes, and she's such a coherent writer, and she takes these really complicated issues and she finds a way to make them just super clear. I really like her a lot. And the other person, another writer named Jenny Odell, who
yes,
wrote a book called How to Do
do
Nothing or
nothing. How
something
to
like
do nothing. Yes.
Right. I love that book. It's really about how to get more silence in your life and how to think as opposed to um, engaging in these sort of mind-numbing kind of distractibility activities that we're all really susceptible to this stuff too. But it's the death of writing is to be involved in social media. It really is the death of writing, I think.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, as a writer, that
Uh-huh.
most of us write on our laptops, right?
Do you?
I do, yes. I always have. I learned how to type as a very young person, and so I've always typed everything that I was writing. I never wrote by hand. And now there's this temptation, that the same keyboard that you're trying to make your work on is the screen in front of you also offers you the opportunity to be distracted and to escape over and over and over. And to really write well, you have to focus and drill down and think. Essays are about thinking and ideas, and you can't have your own ideas if you have this flood constantly of other people's thoughts and ideas coming into your head. My opinion only.
Well, no, but I think that's very important. I think it's also very important if there are any writers listening that they should pay attention to that. And I assume you tell your students that.
Yeah,
Well,
we have many conversations like that in my class.
I hope they listen. I mean, I'm also, well, I think we have come to the end of
We're at the end.
discussion. I could keep talking and keep asking you questions. There's loads more that I'd love to hear from you, but I just want to say, on behalf of the Literary Festival, I really thank you for doing this, and I love your book, and I can't wait to see the next one.
Thank you so, so much to you and to the festival. It's been really, really fun. Thanks a lot.
You bet.
Bye, everybody.